Hello and welcome to Energy Voice Out Loud, the weekly news podcast that keeps you up to date on the hottest stories from the UK energy market. Rosebank awaits a decision.
Plans for a very long delayed, oil and gas field, like Jackdaw, while, literally there's a big, fire kind of burning behind you.
What do we do with nuclear waste?
The UK is building out a new fleet of nuclear reactors and yet still hasn't actually determined how it will deal with high-level nuclear waste.
And is it worth competing with China?
The main consensus of the report is that we shouldn't try and compete with China in the race to net zero because it will just slow climate action and it will drive up cost.
That's a lot to talk about if you're just me. Aberdeen Features lead Ryan Duff, but thankfully this week I'm joined by a crack team of reporters. First up, our fearless leader, news editor, Erica Askland. How are you doing this week, Erica?
Great. Well, I've been on holiday for most of the week, so I'm back.
Yeah, skiving,
it's been really hard, but I'm here, right?
And Northwest correspondent Floyd March, are you still melting down in England, or are you feeling a little bit cooler now?
Oh, it's much cooler. I had a full night's sleep last night. Put on my nice shirt because it's a bit thicker than my thin footy shirts that I typically wear. So yeah, feeling revived and ready to go.
There we go. He's rejuvenated and looking fashionable while he's at it. Now that's what more can we ask for on this video edition of the podcast? And making her video podcast debut, we have London correspondent Jessica. How are you doing this week, Jess?
Yeah, I'm well, thank you. It's warm down here in London as well. I've got to admit, I got off a plane a week ago and the air in London just hit right out of the plane. It was hotter than in the west coast of the States. So yeah, this heat wave isn't going away anytime soon. And I'll be flying the flag here today for, the potential that might be linked to climate change, which I think is undeniable, which is, part of the reason that I think we're all engaged in this debate around net zero that isn't going away.
Certainly. I think that brings us quite neatly onto the opening segment of the podcast, right? Things might not be too warm in the northeast of Scotland, but off the coast it's certainly heating up as we're waiting for Rosebank and Jackdaw to get a decision made. Consultations on Jackdaw was closed last Monday, and then this week we saw Rosebank's consultation come to an end as well. We've seen the government, we've heard rumours that the government might be kicking the can down the road on those decisions until after the summer, after a summer of heat waves and wildfires. Exactly.
Really? Oh, imagine kicking the can down the road. Really? Oh, never heard it.
I'm sure Floyd can sympathise with his attention on the hydrogen sector and delays to that strategy too.
I have to stop talking about it. It's not a thing. It's maybe it'll be a thing one day. Maybe it won't. Who knows? Who cares?
Hydrogen. Smydrogen, right?
Exactly,
as if.
But yeah, this week we saw sort of a plethora of comments come out after the Rosebank consultation, as we did last week with Jackdaw as well. So we've seen, folks in the UK, like the Offshore Energies UK trade body, sort of fighting in favour of it, as well as the Tories. And interestingly, green energy champion Dale Vince also sort of suggested that he supported the project. However, even further afield, we had the Faroe Islands saying, do you know what, if Rosebank and Cambo don't go ahead, our oil and gas industry goes kaput. Whether or not that happens is another thing.
I love the Faroes. They always make such great observations, on the UK's North Sea activity, because of course, they are a very historic, owner of the North Sea, but they just do things different there. So it's always they come to you, don't they, Ryan? You're kind of like their guy at Energy Voice, when they need to say something to, the industry or, kind of lawmakers, they ring up Ryan and say, hey, guess what? This is what we think. It's cool.
I like how sort of important you make me sound. If they need to bring something up to the industry, they go to Ryan. But yeah, the Faroes Energy Industry Group, or FOIB as it's known, the managing director of that, Jan Muller, got in touch and sort of said, these are our points. And the Faroe Islands got a new prime minister earlier in the year as well, and he's all for pursuing an oil and gas industry that has remained elusive to the Faroe Islands. They're still convinced there are reservoirs there, and they think the more West of Shetland exploration that happens, the more activity that happens there, the better the geology will be understood, and the likelihood of projects across the border maybe being found as well. So there's a bit of that. But even here in the UK, we've got some political toing and froing. Obviously, we've had climate protests against Rosebank and Jackdaw over the past couple of weeks as well. So I guess the point to be made here is, do we think Rosebank and Jackdaw are going to get sign off? Because the interesting kind of thing, I feel like the government's got its hands tied with Jackdaw, right? It's said that it's going to support near field tiebacks, predominantly gas projects, and they're going to not allow any new fields under its new licensing program. However, the government has also previously said that it'll honour any licenses awarded before it came into power. So Jackdaw fits the description of that. It's predominantly gas. It ties back to the Shearwater hub. If that is to be rejected, there's maybe a question of, okay, well, what do you mean by, what are transitional energy certificates? How is licensing going to work? Because this seems like it would have gotten acreage under the new plans. So there's that. Rosebank seems to be the antithesis of everything it wants. It seems to be the opposite, right? It seems to be this sort of argument that we should still have new fields being operated and so on and so forth. So, yeah, we've seen Burnham be a little bit more positive on oil and gas than his predecessor. Do we see an option for Rosebank being approved or Jackdaw? What do we think?
I'll tell you what, I had some interesting comments yesterday in Westminster about this. So Shadow Energy Secretary Claire Coutinho said it was the first time that she'd ever agreed with Dale Vince on anything, which I thought was quite interesting to hear. And she also said, now this is controversial. It depends on what side of the fence you are with these projects. But she said that she thought that Andy Burnham was going to do the right thing according to the Tory party, but was too chicken to do it in terms of approving these projects. But I think that the Tory stance on it is very interesting because obviously it's a bit of a U-turn on Theresa May's decision in 2019 to enshrine the 2050 net zero target. Obviously, we've seen a bit of pushback from the party on this. So Kemi Badenoch was apparently one of two prime ministers to actually not have agreed with Theresa May on this.
So is new Tory policy actually now that they're going to scrap 2050 net zero as a target, even though that's in legislation? Is that their plan now?
So I remember hearing Claire Coutinho speak again actually last year at the Energy UK conference in London, and she did hint at repealing back, saying that the Tories would repeal the Climate Change Act and the net zero target if they got into power. To what extent they would actually follow through on that remains to be seen, of course. But I think Claire Coutinho, she previously served in that role as Energy Secretary when her party was the incumbent, and I think that the key message that she was giving at quite a well-attended media event actually was that it's what we've heard before, the idea that homegrown oil and gas projects actually would be potentially and very arguably better for the environment and better for the economy rather than imports of LNG, for example, which are globally up to 4 times more emissions producing. So yeah, it's a controversial debate. It's not going to go away anytime soon.
Yeah, I think this is an idea that's been floated by the Tories for about a year now, right? Because around the time of offshore Europe last year in Aberdeen, Kenny Badenoch came up to Aberdeen and said the same thing. They sort of hinted at tearing up the climate goals, and sort of said to me at Port of Aberdeen that the UK has been taken for a ride on its sort of commitments to net zero and how it's pursued its emissions reductions plans, but the rest of the world maybe hasn't went as fast. Erica, I think you were ready to jump in there. I feel like
Sorry,
I'd be interested to hear your point on Rosebank.
So, I mean, it kind of does feel like, there was the mention of optics, wasn't it? I mean,
Yes.
do you announce plans for a very long delayed, oil and gas field? Like Jackdaw, kind of like while, kind of like literally there's a big, kind of fire kind of burning behind you. Imagine, Andy Burnham, kind of walking away from like the side of an exploding, kind of like gas field or something like that and saying, hey, guess what? We're going ahead with Jackdaw. I mean, I think that's literally what, they're worried about. But, one thing I think about net zero targets is, there's a question. It's not necessarily the case that if Jackdaw and Rosebank goes ahead, that we will not reach 2050 targets, as is. So, and I think that's something that, probably hasn't been 100% agreed. We know that the Climate Change Committee, has said that, there will be oil and gas in, UK supply, when it comes to 2050, because net zero again is it's something that phrase that we're very accustomed to, but net zero is not zero, hydrocarbon production. It is also kind of like taking minus away from the balance sheet, in addition to the plus that comes from emissions of, oil and gas production, use of oil and gas, steel production, cement production, because as Floyd and I were discussing in our, handy little tete-a-tete yesterday, what you need actually for the minus side of the balance sheet is a bit of carbon capture and storage. So, and again, CCC has said carbon capture and storage is a big part of that. Now, of course, everyone who's actually grappling with carbon capture and storage is going, geez, oh, that's really expensive. So,
how do I make
did you
money
notice?
out of this? Is kind
Yeah,
of the
yeah,
argument.
yeah.
And that,
Did you notice that actually I didn't swear there? I could have
I know.
sworn, but I'm
Congratulations.
trying to keep it
First time
clean,
for everything.
for the kids out there signing up to our new, video audiences. But what I think we're looking at, is, we had, like a plan. And, I think the thing, with every, kind of map is, it's very different from, the landscape and, kind of what you get in the, roadmap to net zero is a vast change in, the energy system, our lifestyles. We're all going to have to give up our gas boilers. None of us will be able to, kind of fly abroad unless, we're either very wealthy or very entitled. It's just like this is what net zero by 2050 looks like. So and unless of course, there's a lot, that changes, unless we can fly planes on hydrogen, haha, unless we can, kind of make, SAF, in a way that is actually net zero, but then capture a lot of that damn carbon and plug it into the North Sea as, kind of like the big vision. So does that mean that we can't have Rosebank and Jackdaw? Well, actually, of course, like let's like rehearse, that industry argument. And again, because we are looking at use of oil and gas in the system, at least until, 2045, 2050. The idea is, do we import that if we do not go ahead with production from Rosebank and Jackdaw? Or do we, use, what we've got in Rosebank and Jackdaw, in addition to maybe extending Clare as well? Or maybe then we also go with, other fields up in the west of Shetland as well, because we still need oil and gas on the path within net zero requirements. Is,
well,
the
I'm happy
question.
to play devil's advocate here. So, obviously, the European ETS emissions trading scheme and aligning that with the UK voluntary market for carbon trading will be really key, I think, to how the UK goes forward in achieving emissions reduction in future. And that debate was stalled when Keir Starmer resigned, and it's yet to be seen whether or not Andy Burnham will pick up the baton on that. I think in addition to that, there are some really interesting studies, for example, around the ULEZ emissions reduction scheme in London, which restricts petrol vehicles in certain areas of London, which has been shown to have tangible impacts on air quality and health. So I think that there's definitely an argument to to that there are definitely some health benefits and some clear benefits to aiming towards net zero. I think one of the key things that people don't realize about Rosebank and Jackdaw as well is that crucially, Jackdaw is still going ahead. I think there were always boots on the ground even after
Yeah,
the
both
consent was
projects after the Finch case, after
revoked.
the the High Court ruling last year, the courts ruled that they could keep doing sort of pre-production work, but they weren't allowed to drill and get anything out of the ground until such time. So the NAR Rosebank FPSO is currently sitting west of Shetland, and yeah, there's I think they're all set to go. Jackdaw just need to sort of drill the well and get going. Is kind of the idea, and that's what Adura CEO Neil McCulloch's kind of indicated, where he's saying it'll sort of increase their production by the end of the year if it gets signed off. So yeah, 100%, it's ready to go.
And it's it's not the case that all of the oil and gas that's produced from those projects will be sold in the UK market. So I don't think it's as simple an equation as saying if these projects come through, it will solve the UK's domestic requirements.
There's no solution, and it is just about kind of like we're going to be using oil and gas, and we can use gas directly from the North Sea and into home heating, into the kind of system that comes through Peterhead, albeit kind of oil is a slightly more complicated European kind of project for refining, but it is a European refining project. So I don't know, it is very tricky, very tricky.
Of course, there's the tax take, right? Not all the
Tax
oil
and
and gas
jobs
will
and
be used in the UK, but there's going to be jobs, there's going to be tax revenue that can be used to, fund hydrogen projects, fund CCS projects, or take money off people's energy bills if the government ever decided to make that decision. So yeah, loads of stuff that
It's
we
a
can do
multifaceted
indirectly.
argument,
Yeah, for sure.
certainly, and it's one that I'm sure we could probably spend the entirety of this podcast discussing. But unfortunately, we are out of time. I'm sure we'll be discussing Rosebank and Jackdaw going ahead, even if if the projects go either way, we'll definitely be discussing it. And Energy Voice is the place to go if you want to read that as the news breaks. But that does it for this segment. Stick around because after the break, we're going to be finding out what we do with nuclear waste.
Hey guys, guess what?
What is it, Erica?
Energy Voice is on WhatsApp.
Oh, is that what's been making my phone buzz all day?
It really is. I mean, I can't stop buzzing about this. It's a great way to get the latest updates from Energy Voice because anytime the latest story hits the site, it's out on WhatsApp. And then you get to find out what's going on.
And that makes a lot of sense because, I mean, let's face it, that's how everyone shares their news, isn't it? You text it to your pals, you WhatsApp it to your pals. So your pals at Energy Voice are making sure that they're WhatsApping you with the latest headlines. So, nuclear waste. Well, let's talk about nuclear to start with. The UK government is really sort of pushing ahead with small modular reactors. We've also got Sizewell C in the works. But what do we do when nuclear waste is produced from those processes? Well, Jess, you've been looking at this for some time, and we had a big investigation go live on Monday. Tell us the cliff notes, and then we can dive straight in.
Yeah, so this is an important one. So the backstory to this is that I initially had a sort of industry insider tip off. So I was following this story for a rather long time, so months, over a year, in fact. But from speaking to a lot of people in the industry, I thought that this story was really key to unravel for two reasons. First of all, last year, Ed Miliband said that he wanted us to have a golden age of nuclear, that we were embarking on this huge investment nationally in the nuclear energy industry, which does beg the question, well, if we haven't sorted out how to deal with the nuclear waste, is this really the sort of plight that we want to be embarking on to solve our net zero challenge to produce the baseload clean energy that has been promised from this nuclear build out? And the other reason is that there's really, aside from industry aficionados, aside from industry insiders, there's very little that's actually known publicly about just exactly how nuclear waste is disposed of, how long it's kept, what the processes are, where it's kept, and for how long and how safe that is. So I thought these were all really important questions to get to the bottom of. And as we know, there is a drive at the moment to build out a new fleet of nuclear reactors across the UK. You've mentioned there Sizewell C and Hinkley Point C. So Sizewell C was expected to be a replica using the similar European pressurized water reactors used by EDF as Hinkley Point C, which is a delayed project which still hasn't been built, which was awarded a CFD in 2000 around, I think they were first talking about it with government around 2013, eventually got through by 2016. And of course, the project still hasn't been built. And now it's on track to potentially be built by the end of the decade, so 2030. These projects are getting more and more expensive. So just yesterday, I heard a figure that Hinkley Point C is more than double the cost of the last nuclear power station to be built in the UK, which was Sizewell B, which was built in the 1990s, in the early to mid 1990s, and I believe 1995. And that project is a pressurized water reactor, not one of the advanced ones that's now been developed in the two latest projects that we mentioned earlier. But that project has just recently received a 20-year government-backed extension through, believe it or not, another contract for difference, which is quite controversial because it could mean that, given it's due to end in given it was due to be decommissioned in 2035 and will now run under this CFD until 2055, according to the latest extension, it could mean that it might end up being the first nuclear project to actually be operational under a CFD in the UK, despite Hinkley Point C actually been awarded a contract over a decade ago. So in terms of the investment, we have this huge national investment. The National Wealth Fund has backed Sizewell C, the latest big nuclear power project planned in the UK, with billion-pound commitments, multi-billion-pound commitments. And what's really interesting is I spoke to economists and some of the financiers of that project, for example, and it became clear that actually there's very little data out there for the investors in these projects to rely on when it comes to assessing the risks, the financial risks, and the due diligence around how nuclear waste disposal might impact those projects in future. Now, just to give you a couple of economic figures while we're on the finances of these projects, we all know that Sizewell C, for example, though it reached financial close last year at £38 billion, is actually likely to be a lot more expensive. So the government put in an upper cost threshold of £47.7 billion for that project in the documentation, and it's expected to become a lot more expensive than that due to inflation. Now, one of the reasons that Hinkley Point C has been inflating in cost isn't just to do with the nominal cost of delays. It's also to do with the fact that inflation, since that project was first developed, has been creeping up. Now, in terms of the nuclear waste cost estimate, nuclear waste is often overlooked, but it's actually the largest contingent liability that the UK government holds. So this year, in 2026, the government put out a contingent liability report. Now, contingent liability reports are things that aren't necessarily actually going to happen, but will happen at some point in future, most likely, and be a cost for government. So the government has to account for this. It has to put money aside. So the government's contingent liabilities report found that nuclear decommissioning alone represented a £125 billion contingent liability, which is 47% of the portfolio of contingent liabilities held by government. So this is no small economic risk for the national economy. And the National Infrastructure and Service Transformation Authority, NISTA, has categorised the UK's plans for long-term disposal of nuclear waste as code red, costing an estimated 20.3 to 53.3 billion pounds in 2017 to 2018 prices. That was in one of its recent reports. So hopefully I've just laid out there how much of an economic risk nuclear waste is to the country.
So just for context for our listeners that maybe haven't had time to read through the entire investigation that you published this week, the UK's obviously got this massive bill coming in for nuclear waste, and there's an issue as well in the UK of where do we dispose of it, right? We've heard the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority before, described the current location as the most dangerous building in Britain, and so on and so forth. So I guess the question is there a plan? Do we have something in place that feels tangible and credible?
So I think that's the really key issue. So the UK is building out a new fleet of nuclear reactors and yet still hasn't actually determined how it will deal with high level nuclear waste, the really nasty stuff, the really radioactive nuclear waste, which has a half-life of, hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands to millions and billions of years. So there is a potential solution that the government's been mulling, successive governments have been looking into for many years, which is the idea that high-level nuclear radioactive waste can be buried underground in what's called a geological disposal facility. Now, this potential plan has faced some hurdles, unsurprisingly, the main one being community pushback. So the government was recently looking at up to about 5 sites across the UK that it could have located this deep burial site underground to essentially lock away, according to international standards. In fact, this is the recognised way for dealing with high-level nuclear radioactive waste, storing it deep underground in a facility that the UK simply does not have at present. There's actually a low-level waste facility for a shallower facility in Drigg in Cumbria near Sellafield for burying low-level waste. So that might be the clothing, the protective clothing that's worn by workers at Sellafield or by workers at some of the nuclear power plants in the UK, for example, Sizewell A, which has been decommissioned. Well, actually, some of the low-level waste and items from that project and the building, in fact, the structure, are still actually being decommissioned years on from the initial decommissioning project. So whereas most of the spent fuel has been taken off site and sent to Sellafield by road, by barge, and what's quite interesting is that many people don't realise that the way that nuclear waste is actually stored is it's stored on site until decommissioning. So it's actually stored at the nuclear power stations themselves. So the community in Sizewell, where Sizewell B, the last power station in the UK, was built, they didn't actually realise, according to a campaign group that we've spoken to, they didn't realise that Sizewell B and that the Sizewell community was being turned into a nuclear waste dump. And the reason for this is the initial plans involved a separate plan for decommissioning for removing the spent fuel from site. But in fact, in around 2014, I believe, that changed so that all of the nuclear waste was stored on site at the Sizewell B plant, which still hasn't been decommissioned, mind, and won't be until 2055, in big containers and dry casks, which are actually only made from steel and concrete.
So we've got this massive bill coming. We're not entirely sure where we're going to store, and locals aren't happy if it's being stored on their doorstep. So there's a massive discussion to be had here. Unfortunately, we are running out of time on the segment, but people can, if they're intrigued by what you've been saying here, Jess, they can go over to energyvoice.com and listen, read your entire report.
But don't forget, there's like the big reveal, Jess. There are 2 sites still in contention, and where are those going to be?
So that is true. That is true. So what's interesting is that the government was looking at 5 sites where community pushback. So North Lincolnshire was ruled out. Another site was ruled out due to geological investigations. So the government is actually meant to be reviewing, according to the NDA, this is now with the Energy Secretary for review, Mid Copeland and South Copeland, which are areas of Cumbria near Sellafield, as potential sites for a geological disposal facility. But when we put that to other organisations, other officials, government didn't have a response for us on this, and similarly, other organisations were surprised to hear that actually things had progressed this far. So there's still a lot of uncertainty as to where this facility might be based. And I think also the key thing is that even if the government managed to follow through on plans which are potentially unlikely to locate a geological deep facility underground by the early 2050s, there will be a buildup of spent fuel amounting to thousands of tons from the new projects that are coming online, including the extension of Sizewell B, which isn't yet due to be decommissioned until the 2050s. But the geological disposal facility that is expected to be potentially put in place by the 1950s, if everything goes to plan, is only actually going to deal with intermediate level waste. And it will be years after that when it will be able to actually take any spent fuel at all. So in the meantime, spent fuel in the UK, after these projects are decommissioned, is sent to Sellafield, stored in warehouses in dry casks, and some of it is vitrified. And that vitrified waste is essentially turned into glass, which remains radioactive, put back into containers. And a lot of it is actually shipped overseas at that point. So, watch this space. It could be until the 2070s that we might still have this issue with no permanent way to dispose of spent nuclear fuel. And in the meantime, we will, by that point, very likely, one would hope, all things going to plan, also have Hinkley Point C and Sizewell C operating, and Sizewell B would have been operating for at least another 20 years beyond its expected lifetime.
Well, I'd like to say that I think that does it for this segment. But thank you very much, Jess, for sharing those insights. And like I say, people can have a deeper dive read into your investigation on energyvoice.com. Stick around, because after this break, we'll be speaking about Mingyang again. And is it worth not competing with the Chinese?
Want the energy stories that matter before everyone else? Sign up for the free Energy Voice Daily Briefing. Every morning, our team brings together the stories shaping UK energy alongside the analysis and context you need to understand what happens next. Join the thousands of energy professionals already subscribed. Scan the QR code on the screen or visit energyvoice.com/newsletters to get the free daily briefing.
So, Floyd, you weren't on the show last week, but myself, Ed, and Michael were speaking about Mingyang last week as political tensions continued to flare around the debate around whether we should have Mingyang here at all. What's going to go on? What's happening with manufacturing in the renewable space, specifically wind. But you found a really interesting report from University of Manchester that's kind of hinting at maybe just let them have their cake and eat it too, and we can jump on the bandwagon after the fact. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so pretty interesting, really, how like a Scottish turbine factory can make its way all the way down to the northwest, and it's kind of like a sidestep from Mingyang specifically, but more about the renewable sector as a whole. So I thought it was quite interesting for one, because normally I'll read an academic report and I'd be like, yeah, no shit, like you're telling me something I already know. But this one was a pretty controversial, pretty contentious, like pretty out there. So basically, the main consensus of the report is that we shouldn't try and compete with China in the race to net zero, because it will just slow climate action and it will drive up cost. So basically, the top line from there is that China is, with all of their subsidies and obviously their cheap labor and terrible human rights activities in terms of infrastructure over there, their dominance is helping to actually subsidize the energy transition. So if they can make solar panels and wind turbines at 10% of the cost, 50% of the cost, however much cheaper, then it'd be better for everybody essentially if we just purchase all of this stuff from the Chinese. They mentioned trade tensions and competition can both just hamper decarb plans, but also increase costs. So if we're trying to make wind turbines down in Hull and Humberside, is that going to be more expensive because wages are higher, and they have all these regulations that they have to adhere to, and planning and all that stuff that raises up costs? Is it worth it? So the report came up with four things government. Four choices that the government have. So one of them is to carry on competing with China, to cooperate with China, just to accept China's dominance, and also abandon parts of their energy transition. So yeah, a hefty report, loads to talk about, but lots of implications on the ground.
It does kind of baffle me, this takeaway, mainly because for at least from my perspective, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I haven't done a whole academic report into this, so clearly I'm not as well versed in the topic as your man at Manchester University. But I guess to me, I would argue that more manufacturing capability anywhere on the planet is good, because it alleviates the supply chain constraints that we see, and that by definition will reduce cost to a certain extent. I get that relying on UK labour will cost more than Chinese labour. However, as you alluded to there, there's obviously moral quandaries around that too. But even then, you've also got benefit to the UK, right? In terms of if, let's say, it's not Mingyang, let's say we're speaking about Vestas's NaCl factory in Edinburgh, you've got, much like we were speaking about with Rosebank, if you're employing people and you're doing business here in the UK, you've got corporation tax, you've got income tax on the workers, you've got, it ends up benefiting the UK as a whole as well, which that money can then go into a pot to help fund CFDs and so on and so forth to give surety of investment for renewables developers.
Yeah.
I feel like it's more connected than the report is maybe indicating, but then again, you're the man who read it. So does this get mentioned? Does it sort of like speak about the idea of domestic benefit from more than just manufacturing?
Yeah, it does. And it in the report under the cooperation section in the four things government consider, it is actually very, positive towards projects like Mingyang, maybe over a Siemens factory down in Hull. So what they were saying, if China has the expertise and the know-how to develop these things, that the UK should be bringing in, say, Mingyang up in Scotland to develop these projects, or setting up more steel manufacturing in Teesside, but maybe not British owned, because then that way you get the expertise from China where they know how to do it, more effectively, or even different technologies. But then we also get the tax take from the jobs, the factory, and the local support. They were big as well in Sunderland on having more EV factories, but maybe like Chinese EVs over maybe European or Tesla or so what. So yeah, very maybe pro Chinese. I want to say that, and then the author of the report come at me. But yeah, it was pretty evangelical on the role of China in UK manufacturing.
Can I just say, when I was up at Ardersier a couple of weeks ago, where Ming Yang, had been planning this 1.5 billion pound investment to build full cycle, kind of floating wind turbines aimed at, the vast array of, projects scheduled to be built in the North Sea over the next 20, 30 years. That was blocked. And of course, there's a lot of, sore feelings about that there. Of course, when I came back, I came back to a chorus of discussion on LinkedIn, and particularly from Energy Voice's own, Statler and Waldorf, Jeremy Creswell and Dick Winchester.
Dick Winchester. Do you know what? I'm going to tell them you said that. I think that's an astounding way to describe our columnists.
Absolutely. Now, of course, like their, kind of focus has always been, just absolutely, kind of like really emotional about the fact that the UK has kind of like screwed up its opportunity to build its own manufacturing capacity for what is specifically kind of major industrial opportunity. I mean, there's so much steel, so much manufacturing, cutting of steel, and assembly. I mean, currently, kind of what we're expecting in the UK, kind of with regards to, kind of like 5, 10, 15 Sizewell Cs being built out in the North Sea using, kind of floating and, kind of bottom offshore wind capacity is it's going to be built by someone else, rather than kind of like giving support to the UK supply chain, and that is an absolute travesty. It's a tragedy, but actually, is it actually feasible to think that that can actually happen before kind of like the world extinguishes, without bringing in Chinese manufacturers? I mean, I just don't see it. But it's still a sad thing that it's not happening.
And it's felt on the ground in these regions, like a large part, especially in the northeast, and you go down towards like Hull and North Lincolnshire and Grimsby. They're all deindustrialized for decades. Like the whole point of this just transition, obviously, is for oil and gas workers to find work in other sectors, but it's also to bring these communities that were like left behind. Grimsby specifically for fishing, that could still be reindustrialized in different ways. So yeah, it's felt, I think, very differently on the ground, maybe like what academics think, or maybe even what we in the industry think of, like, so what? Like, we need all these wind turbines. Like, does it matter where it comes from? As long as there's a factory in the UK, like that'll bring some people on board. People in Grimsby, they're probably going to have pretty negative attitudes towards net zero more generally, because they're not going to see any of the benefits. So yeah, it kind of wraps up into that just transition conversation. Another one of
100%.
those buzzwords that kind of mean nothing.
I think it's really a really interesting question, though, especially with the direction of politics right now, because it definitely touches on that tension between, reindustrialization and what that means. And actually, if you look at China's example, China is actually a world leader when it comes to renewables, especially when it comes to manufacturing and technology. But China's emissions are actually rising, and the UK emissions are falling. Even territorial and non-territorial emissions are falling. Reindustrialization, I think, has to be done right. So it was a real blow.
But does
I think, to do
that
on
then
the
raise a
land.
question about offshoring our emissions? If we're relying on overseas supply chains and to provide the infrastructure that we're using to reduce our emissions,
So I
but
think,
those supply
yeah.
chains are emitting, are we actually benefiting in any way? Bearing in mind, you also need to ship this infrastructure here, whereas
Yeah. And
think-
shutting down
you
every
wouldn't have that.
refinery going.
So I think that industrial decarbonisation, which is actually a really dull term here, is actually really key. And we're not just talking about, using wind turbines to facilitate ore refining. I mean, personally, I don't think that's what's necessarily going to be the step change here. I think that one thing that's really key is going to be green steel, if that can work in the UK, if the government can actually harness those steel assets like British Steel, which is now taken public, and decarbonise those assets, then that will hopefully decarbonise the supply chain, especially when it comes to, for example, the wind build out, the offshore wind build out, the floating offshore wind build out, that hopefully will happen in the future, and hopefully decarbonise end to end, not just the supply chain, but our energy as well.
Certainly. I mean, I guess we could get into another conversation about energy costs as well, because I mean, you can't have electric arc furnaces without low energy without low electricity costs, and we don't have that here in the UK either. But unfortunately, we are going to have to round out there. Thank you very much, Jess, Erica, and Floyd, for joining me this morning, and thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to stay up to date with all of these stories as they break throughout the week, well, you can go over to energyvoice.com, read them there, and even sign up to our newsletter so we can tell you about them every morning at 8:30. And of course, we'll see you same time, same place next week.